morning, everyone. We've been having lots of fun tech issues, so we are doing this one for the second time. Sophie will join me in a minute, but today we wanted to talk about emotional intelligence. And last week we started this conversation when we talked about self-awareness. Since then, I have referred so many people back to that conversation, and probably the most interesting piece around that conversation was this conversation around how I see myself and how others see me, and that there is this gap between that. And actually, how do I normalize that? How do I get information so I know what's real, and I can do something with it? So today we're talking emotional intelligence, the father of emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman. Welcome, Fee. How are you this morning?
I'm well, thanks, Kate. And yes, as you were saying, we're very excited to move into emotional intelligence, having done the self-awareness piece last week, and to really understand the facets and what's required from this emotional intelligence. I think one of the things that you and I have noticed in the work we do with culture and leadership is how this is a term we use a lot. Emotional intelligence. It's used quite often. I think people think that they're in touch with it, but our experience is that it's not necessarily in a way that's, other people experience it. So, IQ very much up in our heads. That's, we all know that. We know our cognitive abilities are very strong, fantastic. When we get to the emotional intelligence, that's something that we actually feel in our bodies. It's quite a visceral thing. And the notion that we can just understand EQ as a concept, as something that I need to do, and therefore there's like a formula I can plug in, is a bit misleading. EQ is something you've got to feel. So it's about going a little bit deeper and going, okay, well, what's this sensation, in me? And it's often felt around the heart center because EQ is very much associated with the heart. And how is it that I'm responding to situations? How much am I self-regulating? How am I self-managing?
So here's I'll talk a little bit about what is emotional intelligence, just so we can clarify. But I think there's a good conversation around, can you learn it? Because I had I need to be careful here. I've worked with some people who arguably probably lacked this kind of awareness of others, so this social awareness. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, we talk about self-awareness, which we talked about last week, and self-management. And what's interesting is both of those two are, it's all about me. It's 100% about me. I think sometimes we have a bit of an interesting our ability to be able to understand and get a good grasp of how self-aware we are and how we self-regulate, or how I manage myself. I think it's challenging because it's all about me. It's in our head. This piece around awareness of others, and managing relationship with others, that's about me and other people. So by definition, it gets a whole lot trickier. And so I think that piece at the bottom, I think we're pretty good in organisations around on some level, building on the conversation last week. But people are genuinely want to be self-aware. Obviously, they want to self-manage, and most people spend a lot of time in that space. Because it's a conversation they're having with themselves all the time. I think when we come down to relationship management and this social awareness, I think it gets a whole lot trickier. And the conversation we've been having from a lot of last year around, when we look at organisations in Australia, we don't seem to really do leadership well. There's not a lot of organisations we'd look to and say, wow, they've nailed that leadership thing. We've got probably a lot of good managers. The conversations we have with clients who say, my manager's really supportive. You definitely see pockets of that. But when we take the conversation up to leadership and this more collective conversation, beyond management, this conversation around leadership of an organisation, it's far more complex. And, this social dynamic, and some of the complexities that get in the way, like managing conflict, I think make it really complex. And if what we see in organisations is a reflection, it's difficult.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, EQ is such an undervalued skill in some ways. I mean, it's talked about, as we're saying, it's actually something we need to feel, we need to get in touch with. And we need to get one of the best places to practice it is in situations where there can be constructive conflict. So, you know, I sit as an advisor on a board, and, you know, one of the things I was noticing and calling out in that is, you know, that they are conflict adverse, partly because they don't want to hurt each other's feelings. So they don't want to call each other on things. They don't want to be prepared to have that robust conversation. And it's partly having the skills. It's knowing how to put my view forward without making it personal, or ensuring that actually we're putting what's best for the company first, and therefore we're able to have a conversation which might feel a bit uncomfortable at first. Like any of these skills, you know, the first time we do it, it can feel uncomfortable, but that's part of the beauty, is the more we do it, the more we try it, the easier it becomes. And it's, you know, this social awareness piece requires a real sense of empathy. You know, you and I talk a lot about communication skills and how important just some of those basic listening skills are. Well, we've got to be prepared to hear what other people say without getting down those agendas and rabbit hole, already knowing how I'm going to respond. If we genuinely stop, if we slow down enough to actually hear what the other person has to say and absorb that, and then respond with that information, that's when we see empathy. And that's something I think is rarely or not applied as much in boardrooms, but also in management meetings, you know, in all sorts of organisations.
Yeah, and I think it plays to that point. I agree. The basic communication, you know, listening, good questions. I think that's as simple as it sounds, generally poorly done in organisations, or, you know, in any situation. And so I think that is the pathway. You know, on the question, can EQ be learned? I think without a doubt, you know, some people inherently have more skills in this space. Many would suggest that women have a, you know, the female, you know, the gender bias towards this is strong for women. Certainly, you know, we've seen that in many workplaces, many organisations, of course. With the atrocity in Christchurch, we've seen an amazing representation of EQ coming out of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. And so I think, you know, can it be learned? Yes, but certainly there's, you know, some of us more inherently have EQ, and, you know, the research pretty much shows us certainly women have a bias towards it.
Yeah, which is a really interesting piece. You know, this can be learned, you know, is it intrinsic? I absolutely believe it can be learned, but if it's not something that you have naturally, the first step is recognizing. So the self-awareness piece is that it's something I need to do. And as you were explaining, you know, that piece about self-awareness and self-management, we tend to go, yep, that's me. But when it comes to this social awareness and managing relationships with others, that's where it becomes more challenging. And we're right in the thick of it then, because we can't control everything and it is more complex. So I think what Jacinda Ardern has offered us is someone who is really in touch with that. There's nothing put on about the way she goes about it. There's an authenticity that everyone can connect to. She's able to respond in the moment with the right balance. You know, there's a firmness, there's a directness. She's not in any way being soft about, you know, how dreadful this act was and how horrendous it was. And at the same time, she's holding this beautiful empathy and compassion and concern for the victims and their families, and really for her whole country that's, you know, in shock that something so terrible as this could happen. And then becoming very kind of action oriented and ensuring that, you know, laws are passed so that there can be no repeat of this. So in lots of ways, we're seeing her blend lots of powerful leadership qualities, but absolutely EQ is there as a foundation stone.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, you know, as you're talking, just thinking about the distinction of, you know, the traditional view of leadership. And when I say leadership, I think political leadership is a distinct sometimes from organizational leadership, and the rules that, you know, most of, if we think about all the other leaders, and we've certainly seen, you know, if we're thinking global leadership, we've certainly seen other instances of leaders who do have strong EQ, but, you know, certainly this view of what's in the box and what's allowed, And most, probably most political leaders are dehumanizing themselves to some level to put themselves in the box, to do what they're told to do and to behave in a way that they think they're supposed to behave. And, I think this piece with the New Zealand Prime Minister, she's just being herself.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, when we talk about leadership, it's leveraging your strengths, it's being who you are. And I think that's probably one of the lovely things to see as well.
Yes, absolutely. She's demonstrated that you can be yourself and be incredibly effective. And I think it's quite rare for us to see that, as you say, in the political stage. But I also think in organisations it can be quite rare too, because we are trying to follow certain guidelines and rules. And also there's this polarization that happens a lot. So it has to be an either or, a winner or a loser. There's this lack of inclusiveness means that we end up down some rabbit holes that, what we've seen generally, if something terrible happens, is a whole lot of blame and anger and finger pointing and, negativity. And she just hasn't chosen to go there. It's not that she's ignored the act that's happened, but she's really focused on, how can we support and enable people to get through something that is so horrible? And how can we not make this defining of our culture, but actually show that our culture is bigger than this and can rise above something as horrendous as what's going on? And all of those things point to a very deeply connected sense of emotional intelligence, self-awareness and authenticity.
Yeah, so I think the opportunity here for everyone is probably in, number one, to reflection of, some of those key, traits that sit under social awareness, and then looking at, how do I manage relationships, and probably to start to get underpin, what goes on for me in conflict. How am I reacting? How do I navigate that with other people? I mean, when everything's going well, it's not such a problem. It's when there's disagreements that all of this stuff starts to come up. So I think it's starting to put a spotlight on that. As we talked about before, the basic communications, really listening, asking great questions, asking questions to find out what's not being said, and on top of what's being said. So I think, there's some really good pieces here to start to, as we say all the time, master,
Yes.
staircase our way, small things, inviting feedback from other people. How do you think that went? What could we do differently? All of those sorts of things, to start to look at and explore and deepen this conversation around emotional intelligence. And without a doubt, deepen it in terms of, how it shows up as a skill and as a leadership trait. We're all leaders in organisations. So how does that start to deepen and most importantly, enhance my effectiveness as a leader?
Yes, as you say, there are opportunities, same as with core confidence, every day to be implementing and trying these strategies. And it's definitely, leadership starts with self-leadership. It starts with just demonstrating some of these behaviours with your colleagues. It's not about being in an authority position. It's not about having a title. It's actually about how you show up, how you share your ideas, how you contribute, how you're prepared to take the information from others. Every time you do that, with this quality of emotional intelligence, it actually enhances your standing in the organisation, enhances your personal brand, and it ensures that others are actually able to see good leadership in action. So that's an exciting thing, I think, that everyone gets to influence culture when they take these skills on board.
Yeah, perfect. Well, we might leave it there. We will continue next week our conversation around emotional intelligence. But Fee, thanks for being here. Have a great day. I know you've got a busy one ahead. And guys, if you've got questions, please pop them below. I'm really keen to answer those, of course. If you haven't got a copy of the book, jump over to our website, coreconfidence.com.au. You can buy a copy there. You can also download a free chapter that gives you more of a sense of what we're talking about in there. But see you next week, guys.
See you. Bye.